Hello and welcome to Need to Know, the programme that keeps you up to date with the big changes in the world of education. In this programme, the responsibilities of schools and those who work in them to promote equality and eliminate discrimination. Here to help us through the thicket of legislation in this area is Mike Baker. Mike, people are very familiar with the existence of anti-discrimination laws. I mean, there's the Race Relations Act, the sexual discrimination laws. What's the new things that we need to understand?
Well, Sheena, in the past, schools really only had to concern themselves with discrimination issues on those occasions when a pupil, parent or staff member felt they were a victim of discrimination. In other words, the burden then was very much on the individual to complain and to demonstrate that the school was contravening discrimination laws. The positive duty transfers that burden. It's now down to the school to show that their policies and practices actually promote equality in terms of gender, race and disability, and that they're acting to eliminate unlawful discrimination and harassment. So schools now have to be both more proactive and more explicit in what they're doing to counter discrimination. As part of this, all schools have to produce written evidence in the form of equality policies and schemes, identifying the steps they're taking to eliminate discrimination and to fulfil their duty to promote equality. Alongside these changes, there are now rules outlawing discrimination on the grounds of religion and belief and sexual orientation. So schools have a lot to think about and extra work to do.
So what differences should these changes make?
Well, critics argue it's a case of more bureaucracy and more political correctness. There have even been headlines about boys being forced to play netball because of the gender equality duty and bans on nativity plays because of fears they discriminate against minority faiths. Supporters of these changes say those are just scare stories and argue that the range of discrimination law is appropriate for modern Britain. What's more, there is nowhere better than school to promote enlightened attitudes towards equality in young people. It's all part, they say, of changing the culture of inequality found throughout society.
So what's the key new legislation?
Well, there's a whole lot of legislation. So, for a start, race issues are covered by the Race Relations Act. It was amended in 2000 to include the positive duty to promote equality. For disability, the 2005 Disability Discrimination Act introduced a similar change. And the 2006 Equality Act introduced the new gender equality duty, as well as new provisions relating to discrimination on religious grounds, as well as changes affecting sexual orientation. It was also this act that created the new single equalities body, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. And there's more to come, with a single Equality Act to bring all of this law under one piece of legislation, rumoured to be in the Queen's speech in November.
Right, so the big news is the shift towards promoting equality and eliminating discrimination. Why is this significant?
Yes, you're right. It's a shift to put more onus on the schools to be much more proactive and positive about it. Of course, they've had these duties in the past, but now they've really got to show it before any case might even come along. Let's listen to Sarah Spencer of the Equality and Diversity Forum, an umbrella body which represents campaigning groups, to hear more about that.
The old anti-discrimination legislation is very important because it enables people to complain if they think they've been discriminated against and to get a remedy, but it does put all the responsibility on them to change the system, to stop discrimination. The new legislation shifts that responsibility onto schools and it requires them to be proactive and look and see what a problem might be, much wider than discrimination, all kinds of inequality, and the school itself has to go out and address it. So it's about being proactive and it's about the school taking responsibility.
So schools have a positive duty. What will they have to do to demonstrate they have a positive duty?
Well, there's quite a lot they've got to do, in fact, because all schools are required to conduct a review, a sort of equalities audit of how their policies and practices affect equality both in the workforce and the delivery of services. Now, this could be everything from how many black children a school excludes compared to other ethnic groups, to whether there is sufficient access for disabled pupils, teachers or parents, as well as employment issues, including whether there is a pay gap based on gender in the school. Now, once they've done this, they'll need to publish what is known as an equality scheme, setting out how they plan to promote equality and eliminate unlawful discrimination. This plan must be implemented within 3 years, with annual progress reports and a review of the scheme at least every 3 years.
Is there any evidence that this positive duty is needed?
Well, there has been quite a lot of evidence because back in 2005 there was an outcry about the shocking fact that black Caribbean children are 3 times as likely as white children to be excluded from school. Now, the government responded by asking one of its most senior civil servants, the director of the department's families group, Peter Wanless, to try and find out why. His findings were extraordinary and included this conclusion about race in our schools. The exclusions gap is caused by largely unwitting but systematic racial discrimination. The exclusion gap is due to institutional racism, decisions made by schools and their staff which have the cumulative effect of producing a racist outcome. Strong stuff, too strong for the government as it turns out, who stopped short of endorsing the report and its suggestion that schools are institutionally racist. But clear evidence that there are real concerns in government that racism in schools is a big problem.
Yes, there has been a positive duty to promote racial equality since, 2001? It doesn't sound as if it's working.
No, you're right. It's odd because it has been there for a number of years. But let's go back to Peter Wanless again, because he reported that the response to requirements of race equality legislation from local authorities, schools and parts of the DFES ranges from grudging minimum compliance to open hostility. So there is a real question mark about how effective legislation like this is at addressing problems like racism. Campaigners say it's essential that schools approach the issue as not merely a box-ticking exercise, but as a real opportunity to bring about change. Now, the other aspect of this, of course, is promoting equality in the classroom, as David Winters, head teacher of the Lonesome Primary School in Merton, South London, explains.
We are preparing children for life as adults in Britain. So we want our children to be good citizens. And good citizens respect differences. One issue that arose recently was children saying to those pupils who weren't of British origin to go back to their country. Now, to tackle that, what I did was to take the 4 teams that played before Christmas. I removed from the list of 4 teams those who weren't eligible to play for England. We ended up with very, very few players amongst from the 4 teams who were eligible to play for England. It got across the message that if this is said to people, if this is said to children, if this is said to adults, then our society would be poorer for it. A long-term effect of the introduction of legislation, equalities legislation, will be that people, teachers and others who work in school will have a commitment not because of the legislation, but commitment from inside themselves, a personal as well as a professional commitment to ensuring that the best is done for every child.
Perhaps inevitably there are now charges that these changes represent yet more political correctness gone mad. I mean, you referred earlier to the stories in the papers that boys will be forced to take netball, which is traditionally a girls' game. Any truth in that?
Well, some might say that that is journalism gone mad, although I couldn't possibly comment, of course. But no, I think it's extremely unlikely. There's no requirement in this law that says that schools must make, girls play rugby or boys play netball. I mean, if schools decide to go that way, they can, but they're not forced to do so as a result of this law.
Girls do play rugby already.
Well, exactly, they do already, and many people think it's right to give them an opportunity, but there's no requirement in this. So let's go, and because there's lots of positive things as well that can come out of this, and let's hear a bit more about that rather than those sides of it from Sarah Spencer again.
Well, schools that have actually used this framework to look at things like, for instance, participation in sport, why are girls less involved, by consulting, by identifying what the particular barriers have been to girls being involved in sport, have then addressed those barriers and increased participation. Or if they're looking at attitudes towards disabled children, I know of one school where the history teachers were asked, how could you contribute to addressing attitudes? And they thought, well, we could point out how many people with disabilities have been significant key figures in past history, just a small contribution, but one which can be made within the curriculum itself.
Well, this is generally a topical subject area. I mean, Ed Ball, the school secretary, said recently, I want more young women being encouraged to have a career in engineering, which they may do if they wish, and more young men encouraged to have a career in childcare. Is this all joined up? Are those aims part of this?
I think they are. It's all about making sure that young people feel like they can do anything they wish. Now, we do know that there's been some difficulty in getting, for example, girls to do sciences or boys to do languages. And some schools have really pushed this along, tried to make use of this equalities legislation. For example, there's a secondary school in Redcar that's gone out of its way to give girls an opportunity to try things like bricklaying or firefighting. And what's been encouraging there is that they found that actually 1 in 5 of those children who did these different subjects actually thought it had changed the way they were thinking about careers. And also looking ahead, we've got the diplomas coming along. Now we have diploma in engineering. Now, of course, the government will want and schools will want to encourage girls as well as boys to think about doing that engineering diploma.
And of course, this legislation is not only going to apply to pupils, it'll apply to teachers. I mean, you made some mention to pay differentials. So it offers them protection from discrimination as well.
Yes, all of these aspects will offer some protection to teachers as well. For example, yes, you talked about the pay gap, because we know there's been a lot of concern about that, so that provides protection there. And also things like access to the buildings through the disability legislation. And all of this, I think, is of great interest, of course, to the teacher union. So let's hear from John Bangs, Head of Education at the NUT.
It was going to make a difference, actually, I think, to teachers with disabilities, for example, because there is a big debate about where does the definition of disability stop and where does chronic illness start. And I think the disability equality legislation is actually going to be helping widen the definition there and protect teachers with disabilities in schools. I also think that the legislation is very, very important in other areas, including LGBT, for example.
Of course, the easy bit, as we saw with the race relations legislation, is actually legislating. When it comes to compliance and enforcement, that's much more problematic. How do you think this will go?
You're right, it is much more problematic. And of course, there is this new body, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, and they're in a sense the policemen of this. And it'll be up to them to see what's happening in schools. And if they think things are not being followed, then they could take that through to court. Let's hear again from John Bangs.
I suspect there will be one or two court cases in the future, particularly in the area of disability access, actually. I do think that there may well be the case because a lot of concentration has taken place on building stock, but we do have a lot of old school buildings. And in the past, what local authorities have done is concentrated on upgrading specific school buildings on the grounds of affordability. But actually now all school buildings have to be accessible, and that's where we may well have a case.
Well, that's the concern of the unions. But for a rather different view, let's listen to Sarah Spencer again from the Equality and Diversity Forum.
The Equality and Human Rights Commission thinks that the school hasn't done what it's supposed to do. It can enter into a process of issuing a compliance notice, and if it went down the road and the school failed to comply, it could be taken to court. But it's very much designed to be a process that helps the school get to where it's supposed to be, and it's unlikely that we're going to see very much court action as a result of this, because that's in nobody's interest.
And that's what you need to know about equalities legislation, and you can find out more information on our website. Join us next time for Need to Know, when Mike will again be illuminating another topic in the ever-changing world of education. For now, from Mike Baker and me, goodbye.